17:30 GMT, you're watching BizAfrica. Let's start on the southern end of the continent, where Lonmin, the world's third largest producer of platinum, may be on the verge of a new strike. Now, the prospect of industrial action looms large over a ruling due on Wednesday on the formal recognition of AMCU as the majority union in Lonmin's mines. That ruling may determine if the company faces a new shutdown or if normal production will continue. AMCU unseated the National Union of Mine Workers as the dominant union at the three biggest platinum producers in South Africa, which has the largest reserves of the metal in the world. That change, however, isn't formally or legally recognized by Lonmin, which favors allowing its workers to belong to whatever union they want to. Now, rivalry among mine unions has contributed to some of the worst labor violence seen in South Africa since the end of apartheid in 1994. Wednesday's ruling from the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration will determine what recognition rights under the law AMCU is entitled to. Now, as we've earlier reported, Egypt is bracing for potential economic fallout if mass rallies planned for this weekend descend into chaos. Citing the 15 million signatures the protest organizers have managed to collect so far, analysts expect a huge turnout on the 30th of June. Now, although political forces have promised that these protests will be peaceful, there are fears by some individuals that these protests could turn violent, and that in turn could cause even more damage to the struggling North African economy. CCTV's Yasser Hakim now reports.
Ahmed Salim is a street vendor who sells his goods in downtown Cairo, close to Tahrir Square. Like most sellers and shop owners in the area, he has been affected by recent demonstrations and expects the 30th of June to be nothing different.
I'm not working on the 30th because people are afraid to come during demonstrations. They are saving their money for food and other basic goods. It happens every time there are protests.
Though the rebel demonstrations are still a few days away, the economic effects have already been felt in other sectors too. According to government figures, tourism witnessed around 60% cancellation of trips to Cairo and Alexandria, cities that usually host the largest demonstrations. On the other hand, banks and financial institutions will not close on that day, except ATMs, which will be out of work to avoid lootings. The stock market index fell by 11% and losses reached $3 billion in the last week alone due to mass sellings by shareholders who fear the worst next week.
The stock market will open its door unless the situation turns violent. As a precautionary measure, we will suspend trading for an hour if shares fall by 2%, not the usual 5%. Trading will continue unless there is violence. We are monitoring with banks. If they close, we will too.
Meanwhile, citizens are stocking up on basic household necessities in preparation for prolonged protests or violence.
There could be shortage of food next week, so we have to be ready with stocks, food, water and batteries for electricity cutouts.
Some traders are abusing the people by increasing prices this week. We are helpless in the middle of corrupted politics and greedy traders.
The government has stepped in to allay the people's fears by announcing extensive security measures on Sunday to protect public property and commercial areas. It will also provide extra supplies of basic goods and necessities to the markets to make up for any expected shortages next week. Egyptians are anxiously awaiting the events on the 30th of June. And even for shop owners here who are pro-demonstrations, they are hoping it passes peacefully without any violence, so not to affect their businesses. This is Yasser Hakim for CCTV, Cairo.
An estimated 40% of Somali families who rely on overseas remittances for food and basic sustenance are up in arms over the move by UK's Barclays plc to close its account with Somalia's Dahabshil Bank. Now, Dahabshil essentially is a global business, which is what is known essentially and operates in the area of hawalas or informal money transfers, and it has accounts with Barclays through which it helps provides cash transfer services to millions, quite literally, of Somalis. Barclays has said it will close accounts on the 10th of July in order to tighten the noose, if you will, on money laundering and unchecked funding of terror outfits. Well, the details from Somalia. Here's CCTV's Mohammed Hirmoge.
Somali money remittance businesses have appealed to one of the last major banks not to close its accounts, warning the move could cause a serious economic crisis in the country that's only just recovering from 2 decades of war.
We are sad that Barclays wants to close these accounts. It would have terrible implications on the Somali people. We hope there would be intervention to stop this from taking effect.
Somalia's large diaspora community depend on the Hawala money transfer system to support families back in the impoverished country.
It will have huge implications for millions of Somalis who actually live on remittances from their friends and family members in the diaspora. I think, we know maybe as many as 40% of the entire population of Somalia actually lives on remittances from family members abroad. And for this to happen in the UK, of all places, is particularly alarming because the UK has one of the largest Somali diasporas. Maybe as many as 500,000 people live in the UK.
The UK government is now being urged to stop Barclays Bank from closing the last account. International banks have been closing down the accounts of the money remittance companies to crack down on both fraud and terror funds.
The concerns that the banks have is that some people might be using their system to funnel through money to groups that are carrying out terrorist attacks, and that is a legitimate concern for banks to have.
Somalis send money home via transfer agencies known as Hawala that accepts deposit abroad and within hours credit recipients in Somalia, even in the remote towns. Millions of Somalis live on remittances from abroad as their only source of income. Barclays Bank, on the other hand, says does not want to transact businesses with firms that lack control to monitor where their money goes to. Mohammed Hirmogi, CCTV, Mogadishu.
Let's expand that conversation. CCTV's Mohammed Hirmoga is live in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. Melanie Ralph is live in London as well tonight. Thank you both for your time. Mohammed, let's start with you and the worst case scenario. Let's say the Barclays does close Dahab Shell's account on the 10th of July as threatened. What's the ripple effect that will have on the millions who depend on remittances in Somalia?
Roma, it's quite a complex situation here. For the Somalis, this is a lifeline. For the 1.5 million also Somalis who solely depend on the remittances from their kin abroad, it is their lifeline. It's their only source of income. On the other hand, for Barclays, they see this as a requirement. They're saying they need only to transact business with companies and firms that they know the source of their money and where their money ends up, something which the Hawala systems don't actually account for. Therefore, it's quite a complex situation. Speaking about the impact, it will first of all weigh heavily on the 40% of the Somali population that solely rely on these money remittance systems. Two, it will crumple the economy, the shaky economy of this country, now that the country has been reeling from a devastating famine of 2011. And the fact that this country the dollar actually is the preferred trade currency over here. Plus the banks also, $1.2 billion is involved per year. The money remittance system that is involved is $1.2 billion per year. And the banks charge between $2 to $5 every $100 of the remittance. Therefore, you can put the mathematics over there and find that the banks too will have to lose out on this. Rama.
Indeed. Melanie, coming to you in London, Barclays essentially argues that, look, the bulk of this business isn't with us, it's with the likes of Western Union and so on and so forth. If that argument has any merit to it, why is there so much uproar about this decision in London?
Well, Rama, any way you look at this, the channels for people getting money back to home to Somalia is getting squeezed. Reports suggest that alternative remittance routes aren't as widely available as Barclays' service, including Western Union, who doesn't have a presence in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. Barclays offered a safe and reliable service with a reputation that's hard to replicate. The fear now is that people will find unsafe, illegal, and more importantly, untraceable channels to transfer their money. And Barclays isn't alone. The Somali Money Services Association says that 12 of its 17 Britain-based members have lost accounts with major banks in Britain, including HSBC London. So slowly but surely, the remittance channels for Somalis are drying up.
Hirmoga, coming to you, let's talk about Dahab Shell. It's also, of course, been affected quite a bit here by Barclays' decisions. Assuming Barclays does shut down its account by the 10th of July, what are its options?
Dahabshil is part of, as Melanie has just been saying, the members, 17 members of the Somali Money Service Association, SOMSA. Well, 12 members of the SOMSA had their accounts closed, and Dahabshil is one of the remaining 5. By the way, Dahabshil remains the biggest money transfer remittance agency over here. Therefore, Dahabshil will heavily lose out, and it actually does not have much options left. By the way, there cannot be an option that can substitute the Hawala system and that can be quite as effective as the Hawala system. Therefore, we're not sure whether Dahabshil will be able to provide any substitute to the Hawala system. Suppose Barclays makes good the threat to close their accounts by 10th of July.
Melanie, in the letter Barclays wrote to Dahabshil, they essentially told the institution CEO that they were cutting ties primarily to reduce the commercial risk exposure. Have we had any elaboration on this from Barclays' side?
Yeah, well, let's make this clear. Reports say that the termination of the relationship with Dahabshil was down to a change in Barclays' eligibility criteria, not a reflection on their anti-money laundering standards and such like. So Barclays are making drastic changes to its business in this arena and shrinking its operations between Somalia and Britain. In a broader statement, not directed at Dahabshil, Barclays issued a statement saying they fear money via transfer firms could end up in the hands of terrorists, that proper checks aren't in place to spot criminal activity. So Barclays is being pressurised to comply with regulations in this country, which unfortunately means tightening rules within this area that carries potential money laundering risks.
Indeed. We'll have to leave you there for the time being. Thank you very much for your time. CCTV's Mohammed Imoga in Mogadishu and Melanie Ralph in London. We'll have to leave you there for the time being. Now, we're taking a short break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll be talking to Francis Wangusi, the Chief Executive of Kenya's Chief Communications Commission, on taxes and tariffs and all matters airtime in East Africa when we return. Welcome back. Now, the 20th edition of the East African Communications Organization Congress is taking place in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, this week. That meeting is being held under the theme of making broadband work for social and economic growth in Africa. The question of how to get member countries to draw synergies and to move from the deliberation phase to the implementation one is one of the biggest areas of focus. Now, legislation, collaboration and public and private partnerships will also be discussed as ways to achieve the much needed economic growth in the region. The forum will also be exploring ways of addressing high mobile calling and roaming charges where call costs across the continent apply. Say Kenya to the UK or Kenya to India are cheaper compared to those between Kenya and Burundi, which essentially negate the essence of integration and becomes a barrier to regional communication and, by extension, trade as well.
Thank you, Rachel.
As I mentioned earlier, Francis Wangusi is the Chief Executive Officer of Kenya's telecommunications regulator. He joins us now live in studio. Mr. Wangusi, it's 2013, quite a few interesting tech developments all over the world. Why is it that it's still so expensive to call within East Africa compared to calling between Kenya and India or Kenya and the United Kingdom?
Thank you very much. So far, yes, I would accept to a certain level that there is very high roaming charges within the East African countries. But basically, I think the reasons arise from the fact that there are disparities in policies with regard to charging of fees within East Africa. Secondly, I think the cases of fraud in East Africa has been on the rise, and certain countries within East Africa have implemented measures to be able to help in trying to curb fraud, like those of SIM cards, as well as cheating on termination minutes within the East Africa. Now, because many of us have not been able to implement the same framework, it has been a little bit difficult for us to come up with a balance in terms of having a single network where people can roam freely within East Africa. But we believe that with the IACO Congress that is taking place now in Nairobi, those are some of the teething issues that are on our agenda, and we expect to get our way forward in trying to make East African people roam with low charges than what they are having today.
Let's talk about some of the specific issues that you face. Governments across East Africa, specifically Uganda and Rwanda, have either imposed or are planning to impose higher taxes on international calls. Now, as a regulator, how do you then deal with those barriers, those policy issues that governments across East Africa throw up? Yet they say that they're trying to foster economic integration across East Africa.
Indeed, it is really a tall order for regulators within East Africa, but however, we try to advise our governments that in order for access to be achieved, in order for the people of East Africa to use ICTs for their socio-economic development, both rich and poor, then the charging of the services should be made as low as possible. Taxes on ICT services should not go beyond certain levels where they can be a hindrance to the people of East Africa from accessing the charges. But you know, we don't control the other arms of government that are responsible for areas of taxation. But we are hoping that we would send the message across that really it is not taxing heavily the ICT sectors that is going to make it more productive and produce more revenue to the government, but at least enabling people to use it, enabling diversity and innovation in the usage of the ICT services is what is going to spur economic development for this country. But as regulators, indeed, that is what we are trying to do.
Right. Let's move on finally to one very specific issue in Kenya. Over the last 5 years, CCK has concentrated on bringing the cost of calls down to a very large extent. Over the next 5 years, will your attention turn to data to try and get data costs in this country to the lowest possible level?
Yes, indeed, we are putting strategies in place. We know broadband penetration in Kenya is still low, like in many parts of the East African countries. And we know the costs of access to broadband is still high. But the government in Kenya has come up with strategies, including public partnership, in trying to put up a broadband infrastructure that would be able to be accessed at cost-effective rates, and that will enable the data prices for the people of Kenya to be low. We are also looking towards starting a universal service fund, which we believe we will have to implement it from the current coming financial year from July. This will also help us to be able to get communication infrastructure to areas where people are not yet able to access communication services at a cost that is affordable. We have also come up with a national broadband strategy, which we are going to implement soon, that will also help us to leverage on the various kind of technologies that we have around in order to be able to ensure that access to broadband and to the extent to data is affordable and can reach the rest of the country, in a short time as much as possible.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Francis Ongusi. We'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That, of course, has been Francis Ongusi. He's the Director General of the Communications Commission of Kenya. Let's move on to something completely different now. China's Exim Bank is to increase its investment in the African Export-Import Bank with a view to helping the Pan-African lender to meet rising demand for trade finance right across the continent. Now, the details of that emerged at the 20th General Meeting of the Exim Bank. CCTV's Trevor Mbija has more.
The president of the Exim Bank, Jean-Louis Ekra, said that China's Exim Bank is involved in various projects in Africa. This comes at a time when the BRICS grouping of the fastest growing emerging economies is gaining in importance in the African trade.
There are several other projects, similar projects, in Ivory Coast, in Benin, in the telecom area, in the telecom sector, where we are working with China Exim, also in Nigeria in the telecom sector.
Established in October 1993 as a Pan-African Export-Import Bank, Exim Bank is charged with developing African trade, generating profit, expanding, diversifying its products, while also serving as a center of excellence on the African trade matters. The institution has an authorized capital of $5 billion and promotes both intra and extra-African trade through offering credit, bearing risk, and offering trade information and advisory services. The bank's ties with China have continuously strengthened with growing investments in Africa, especially by China.
Besides putting capital into the bank, the China Exim Bank has provided additional financing to Afrexim Bank, and they've participated in joint projects in a number of different countries.
Oil companies in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Sudan are among the largest beneficiaries of the bank. The bank provides line of credit facilities in 45 African countries. The bank will be financing Kenya Airways with nearly $2 billion to equip its fleet. That's according to Franklin Kennedy, and it's at its final stage on financing a power project in Tanzania.
In the last 6-7 years, and particularly since the international financial crisis, it's had substantial growth because it's been able to step in and support African trade at a time when a lot of the international banks were not in a position to do so.
African trade has grown from $200 billion in 1999 to $1.3 trillion currently, even though it's dominated by unprocessed commodities. It is clear, though, that Afrexim Bank will have a crucial role to play as Africa's growth and trade escalates. Trevor Ombija, CCTV.
Let's make a quick run through the markets now. As you might recall, of course, yesterday on this lovely little board here, the markets were entirely in the red. Very different story. Now you've got green somewhere in the north and the south, and it's bracketed, of course, by losses elsewhere. Like here in Nigeria, the all-share index down 1.99%. Over in South Africa, the market ended the day high by almost 3/4. The 20-share index in Nairobi still very much in the grip of that bear run, down about 0.8. And the Egyptian market closing the day in the green to the tune of about 0.2. That's business news for now. We'll be back at 1700 GMT on Wednesday. See you then.